All truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident.
It's that there are people if they're working in the U.S. and they want to remit money to Mexico, historically they've had to pay a big chunk, like 7% on a small transaction to Western Union. And if we had a retail CBDC that could be used both in the US and Mexico, or if the Mexican peso CBDC and the US dollar CBDC both ran on the same blockchain, we could exchange one for the other at basically zero cost.
We've seen the big players in government gravitate towards Ripple. Rosie Rios, Donald Donahue, Michael Barr, Jess Chang. Right now, there is work being done for central bank digital currencies. However, it's becoming politicized. The path of least resistance is to have the private sector create a cross-border payments platform. Barry Eschgreen is a former IMF and central banker. He has been interviewed by David Schwartz on Blockstar and has some sort of rapport with the employees at Ripple. Having money issued on the XRP ledger and allowing the XRP ledger to become the settlement protocol has a strong argument.
Is strong too. And across borders, Western Union is experimenting with blockchain, and Ripple, a company in San Francisco, is experimenting with technologies to move money across borders. Arguments for those private sector initiatives are strong.
Having central bank money on a ledger will allow an array of different use cases. Financial institutions look at risk, and with stablecoins, you're adding in additional layers of risk. By allowing central banks to issue currencies on these ledgers, the use cases will flourish, while keeping a distance from public to private. For years, we've seen use cases after use cases being explored. Big banks, central banks, large institutions, big corporates are all testing these protocols. Ripple, as well as other select protocols, are customizing their chains to incorporate CBDC or central bank digital currencies. This is the base layer of finance, and for the advanced use cases to be efficient, for advanced use cases to go mainstream, there needs to be central bank money on chain. And this is happening. Ripple just announced their partnership with Ireland.
So how can I link a smart payment to an event? So my money is not released until a package is delivered and scanned, till a bond is issued, or till some other activity happens. But for those of us that have a background in institutional finance, there really wasn't an option to have money on ledger. So on R3, on Corda, we have tons of different assets and 100 plus applications. But when we try to settle with money, we actually have to jump off chain and go through a traditional channel, which introduces all sorts of inefficiencies and risk, and is far from ideal. The crypto craze was just a distraction because that's not appropriate for institutional finance. And while regulated stablecoins may be an answer at some point in the future, there's no consistent regulation. So what sits at the center of finance? At the center of everything is money. And what sits at the center of money, which is the central banks, and the central bank digital currency. So when we think about the promise of the technology, and there's been scores of papers written about the billions of dollars of savings, about financial inclusion, about new products that can be built on our technology, we need money on ledger. That is the grease, if you will, that will lubricate the wheel and accelerate all of this so that we can actually realize the potential.
Central bank money is key. David Rudder from R3 knows this and understands what's at stake. He summed this up perfectly. Unless central banks are completely eradicated in the next few years, they are needed for this transition. Central banks are going to have a process before they issue currencies on ledgers. In my opinion, this is going to have network effects. There's no point in issuing currencies on networks that have zero transactions, that don't have other central banks issued assets on the ledger. XRP Ledger is one ledger that is testing a pilot with Palau. There are dollars issued on the XRP Ledger. The entire world is watching this pilot, and so far so good. This is a report that outlines the success of PSC, or the Palau stablecoin. I will add it in the link in the description below for you to take a look for yourself. Before we continue the show, I'd like to take a moment to thank Incogni. Incogni is a service that asks all data companies and brokerages to remove your data from their databases. There was a law that was passed that allows U.S. citizens, EU citizens, and other countries to have your data removed from their databases. This is how the internet works. Everything is surveilled. Every site you go to, every application, everything built on the web is using you as the product. They take your information and sell it to anyone that wants the data, and sometimes this includes malicious actors like hackers. There are people that use this data for social engineering attempts. For example, you receive a phone call. "Hi, John, you have the last 4 digits of your social, 0421. Well, it looks like you owe the IRS $10,000, and if you don't pay this by the end of the week, we're going to be forced to take you to court and send a bunch of fines. So use this link and make sure you pay the payment by today." That's a real life example that has happened. When you sign up to Incogni, they have a list of data brokerages and they start emailing them one by one saying that this person, their information needs to be removed from your website under this law. And they just keep at it until all data brokerages eventually remove your data. I've used this for several months now, and the entire time it's just constantly reaching out to data brokerages and updating their database with new data brokerages to reach out to them. So incogni.com/Darren. Be sure to check them out. And if you sign up today, you'll get a special discount.
There have been scores of digital bonds issued, and that's exciting for a lot of reasons because you can fractionalize them and a lot of other things you can do with them. But the vast majority, except on SDX, have been really issued for show and then are novated back to the traditional rails. And a lot of those traditional rails are systemically important financial institutions with 40-year-old technology. So we don't want to go backwards. But to have a truly persistent digital bond, we need to have CBDC on ledger as well, so that we can lend those bonds, so that we can repo those bonds, and so that we can pledge those securities. And if you haven't read about it, the Swiss National Bank, the Central Bank of Switzerland, has begun to make CBDC available on SDX, which is the Swiss Digital Exchange, the sub of SIX, and have issued a number of truly digital bonds that can persist and trade in the secondary market. Derivatives can be written against them and the like. So we need to see more of that. And a little later, maybe we can talk about the international trade and what it can do for remittances and the like.
Central banks around the world have found themselves in this situation. You see, they've printed way too much money and there is a loss of confidence. However, with technologies such as CBDC, as tokenization, you'll be able to see things like negative interest rates, and this is going to change the financial landscape. For almost a decade, central banks were printing money, keeping interest rates at 0% interest rates, yet there was very little inflation. Their whole goal was to keep inflation at 2%. And what ended up happening is C-19 came along, the government shut us into our own homes and then gave out stimulus checks, which was the worst possible thing to do for the economy. The economy functions by people producing things, by people creating things. Now, when the economy comes to a halt and then people are buying things on Amazon and buying things online, the supply chain became stressed. And we're still seeing that problem today. The supply chain hasn't caught up. So prices are fluctuating to the upside. Now, when you've introduced these new technologies, you're going to have transparency, auditability, and you're going to be able to apply these not just to financial assets, but to assets that are on the supply chain. As technology grows, it's going to bring the prices of goods and services way down. And this is in perfect timing because the central banks have lost control from a math point of view. If you have $32 trillion in debt at 5-6% interest, mathematically, these numbers are going to snowball. But if you're able to combat that with efficiency, changing the supply chain, bringing costs down from a consumer level, from the actual physical standpoint, to the consumer, you would be able to control prices. And all they really need to do is change some regulations, and this whole system evolves for the better.
Saudi with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but rather with United Arab Emirates. The transaction wasn't between China and Saudi Arabia. It was between China and United Arab Emirates. Though China, as you may know, and I did a video for you guys, just agreed about 2 weeks ago to use the Chinese currency to settle their own oil transactions by bypassing the US dollar. So this is very significant. And again, there is not a lot of reporting on it. So this is the reason what prompted also the Saudis to go ahead and swap the currency with China, because this saw what United Arab Emirates did. Mind you, there's the discussion that took place during China's meeting or summit in late 2022. That was in December of last year. And that meeting, I don't know if you recall this or not, was attended by President Xi. And the focus on it was to ensure that China prioritized the renminbi settlements in oil and gas transactions.
The UAE accepting digital yuan allows the UAE to purchase anything that China produces. You see, China has capital controls, which means you can get money into China, but it's very hard to take money outside of China. So the UAE is trading their oil and natural gas for Chinese digital yuan, and this allows them to purchase anything that China manufactures. So this isn't really an attempt at the reserve status, but it's showing you a trend. It's showing you a trend that digital currencies do not have to be in the traditional banking system. And when more and more countries move to digital currencies, we're going to see this trend greatly continue, and it's going to have significant impacts on dollar and dollar hegemony.
Through this logically, if Xi Jinping is backed into a corner and he's got youth unemployment somewhere between 20 and 40%, he's got disillusioned youth. He's got a real estate market that's collapsed. He has wealth management products that aren't paying. His regime is in real risk if he doesn't refocus the national narrative. And my view on that is a move on Taiwan would refocus the national narrative more than backpedaling in financial markets. So while I understand her desire to not be invaded, and we all hope that doesn't happen, but if you were to look back over the last 50 years, and choose a date and a time at which you thought America was its most vulnerable and had the worst leadership it's had in the last 50 years, I think you would choose 2024 as maybe one of your strike points.
There's so much happening on the geopolitical front, and we have politicians talking about what happens if China invades Taiwan, but it looks like a similar situation to Hong Kong. When China took Hong Kong, there was very little resistance that took place. China just acted really quick, and it just happened. Same's going to be true with Taiwan.
Upwards of 100 million apartments or condos that are vacant today in China. And again, the architecture of their banking system is really important to understand. They've got roughly, I'm going to use dollars, but it's really in RMB. They've got about $57 trillion in banking assets. They've got about, 2 trillion in banking equity. And then they've got their local government financing vehicle market, which financed all their real estate. Local markets is a $13 trillion market where 90% of the market's in default.
90% of the market is in default. Think about that number. And also think about all of the investors that are in crypto that come from China, as well as Tether, that may have exposure to China's commercial paper. If there's a financial crisis in China, it's not going to stay in a vacuum. It's going to spread across the world really rapidly.
You look at what happened after the sanctions of the US on Russia. What did Russia do? They end up swapping up with the currencies between them and Russia, between Russia and India. You all get the idea. So in other words, there are some changes that have been implemented. And like I said before, it's not easy to put a financial infrastructure in place to replace the SWIFT system overnight. It ain't going to happen. It's going to take time. But
When the US sanctioned Russia, they proved to the world that the US dollar system cannot be trusted. At the same time, China is proving to the world that you can bypass the entire US banking system. There's no more need to go through the current rails. You can create your own rails with digital currencies with crypto assets.
Crypto. But I do think that the jurisdictions that will win will be the ones with clearer regulations because, I think like maybe in the past there was some romance of like a gray area, but as we're seeing now in the US with all the SEC lawsuits, like there's no romance there because just because like it's gray doesn't mean that it's okay, right? So basically what happens is you could end up spending years and millions of dollars fighting in court, which we've seen with Ripple and we're seeing with Coinbase. So I do think that like the countries that sort of win or the countries that attract talent will be the clearer jurisdiction.
There was recently an executive order for artificial intelligence, and this targeted computational resources. Now, the intelligence agencies are very concerned about cyber attacks. The different intelligence agencies are being under constant attack by cyber criminals. Now, North Korea, China, all over the world, these different countries have divisions that are focused just on hacking. And it turns out that the United States plans to fight back. And this is why blockchain technology is pivotal, because it could transform the internet that we have today into a more secure and resilient system. All truths are easy to understand once they are discovered. The point is to discover them. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you enjoy content like this, please consider joining my Patreon or my ghost site, dmjr.ghost.io. Thanks, guys.